This is going to be the second PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 7. The title of the PowerPoint lecture is American History, Unit 3, Lecture 5, The Growth of Federal Power and the Missouri Compromise. So foreign affairs after the War of 1812. Just some key events. James Monroe would be elected president. Some things underneath his presidency that happened. The northern border with Canada would be established in 1817 at what is called the 49th parallel. So basically, that straight line that borders Canada and the states of Minnesota, North Dakota, and what are now Montana. In 1819, there was a treaty that was called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and this officially brings Florida as a state into the United States. And also one of the a foreign policy statement that was named for Monroe, called Monroe Doctrine, explains and tells European nations to not interfere in North and South America. So basically they said to just leave both North America and South America alone, and this attempts to establish the United States without a threat of foreign intervention, meaning they didn't want other countries from like Europe or Asia to come over into this part of the world, basically. Federal power grows. In the years following the ratification of the Constitution, the power of the American government grows. A little bit of background about this. We have what is called the Necessary and Proper Clause in its relationship to the National Bank and the Louisiana Purchase. So basically, there is a clause in the Constitution that says that the government, that Congress, has the ability to do things that are necessary and proper, and that might not be stated in the Constitution. However, they meaning the federal government, might have power to do things, and those things would be, an example would be the National Bank and then the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Those things weren't in the Constitution. The Constitution didn't say that the federal government could or could not purchase land or could or could not establish a national bank. However, if things come up in the future, the national government does have the power to exert its power. And the power of judicial review, we see that there with Marbury versus Madison. So the precedent of federal power is in place, meaning that the government and the Congress have the power to do things that might come up later on that might not exactly stated in the Constitution. John Marshall would become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he uses that power of judicial review to grow the power of the government. Two important Supreme Court cases that you will need to know in 1819 would be McCulloch versus Maryland, and this rules that individual states cannot pass laws that interfere with federal powers. I'm sure you've heard of the term supreme law of the land. That means that that's the Constitution, that whatever the Constitution says goes, that the states cannot pass laws to overrule the Constitution. And you'll do an activity here about McCulloch versus Maryland and learn a little bit more about that Supreme Court case. In 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden was was a Supreme Court case that ruled that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce, or the buying and selling of things across state lines, as well as shipping across state lines. And you'll do another activity here a little bit later on, learning more about Gibbons versus Ogden. But these two Supreme Court cases were all about growing the federal power of the government. So the Louisiana Purchase opened new territories for settlement and eventual statehood. And something that came about, this big question was, would these new states be free states or would they become slave states? Okay, and this is uh, where the Missouri Compromise comes into play, and I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise um, occurred because of this new territory that was purchased called the Louisiana Territory. So if we see in the map down here, states are beginning to form. So we have the state of Missouri already forming, and then you have Louisiana, and we have what is called the Arkansas Territory, which will Arkansas will be, carved out of that, as well as Oklahoma is to the left or to the west of that, and Oklahoma is not yet. So the abolitionist movement had begun in the North, meaning they started to disallow slavery. So in the green parts of the northern states, it says, according to the map, free states and territories that are closed to slavery. And then in the south, in the orange color, you have slave states and territories that are open to slavery. So most northern states had begun to outlaw slavery, and Midwest farmers did not want to compete with um, the slave labor. So basically, Midwest farmers in Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, they didn't want slavery to be pushed out there at all. And in 1820, there's an equal number of slave states and free states in the United States at the time. Okay, and the Missouri Compromise, with Missouri becoming a slave state, um, Missouri would be added to the Union as a slave state, and then Maine, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, Maine will be added as a free state. So that kept the balance in 1820 of free states and slave states. Why did they want to have a balance? Well, in Congress, you have representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and neither side, the free states nor the slave states, wanted to have, you know, they didn't want their opposite side to have an upper hand on them in Congress, so they want to make sure that it was balanced. So what happened was the Missouri Compromise was signed, and it said that from here on out, Missouri would be grandfathered in the state, but if you look at that line, that 3630 parallel, that imaginary line would go all the way across to the Pacific Ocean, and after the Missouri Compromise, any state that is created in the unorganized territory north of that line would be a free state. Any state below that 3630 parallel would be a slave state. So that was the compromise, okay? Was an imaginary line would be drawn across, Missouri would be added as a slave state, and Maine would be added as a free state. And on this page, I'm just kind of reiterating that the Missouri Compromise was the debate over the entry of Missouri. So basically, when you're a territory, you have people that live in your state. Like, if, for example, in the picture it says Arkansas Territory. When there's enough people that occupy that area, then that territory can apply for statehood. They literally have to apply like they're applying for college or for a job. And then once they meet their requirements, then they can become officially a state. Okay, so that's what Missouri was doing, and then that's what Maine did up in the right-hand corner as well. So what the compromise was that Missouri, like I said on the previous slide, Missouri and Maine would enter at the same time to keep the balance in Congress and to keep the balance in the country. And then they said, all right, well, let's draw a line, an imaginary line at this 3630 parallel, and that will determine the future of slavery in the United States. That anything north will be a slave state, and anything south will be a slave state. right, so basically just reiterating, the 3630 parallel was to determine the future of slavery's growth in America. At this time, that all that brown area that was occupied by Mexico, and then you see the Oregon Territory claimed by the United States and Great Britain. So we kind of shared that, but then Great Britain will give that Oregon Territory up to us eventually. All right, so Missouri Compromise temporarily solves the slavery expansion question, like will slavery be expanded into these new territories out west? Slavery will play a key factor in sectionalism, and remember, sectionalism is one of our vocabularies, and sectionalism is a conflict between northern and southern sections of the country. And politicians were looking for ways to unite the country, and we talked about one of the ways through the American system that they tried to unite the nation a little bit earlier in the chapter. We talked about that.